And okay, with this week's Sedra is Parshas Balak, and of course, what Balak was the king of Moab, and he tried to get, and Billam was a non-Jewish prophet. Why he received prophecy is a question that we will discuss, but he was a prophet for the nations of the world, and he tried to get Billam to place a curse on the Jewish people. And the Gemara, and then Billam attempted. First, God warned him not to do it, but then again and again and again, he asked God, perhaps I could go. Perhaps Balak is going to send outstanding individuals, great people of high positions, people with money, and God, in a sense, acquiesces in a certain degree. He says, you can go if you want. But you have to do it the way I tell you. You cannot curse the Jewish people, and you'll have to say only over what I tell you. But Billam is interested in the high regard of having all these great leaders, meeting with them, and people who are very rich, and the money that Balak promised him for attempting to curse the Jewish people. So they and because of that, so this is what this Sedra is about. And it's interesting, till the very end, there is very little mentioned about Moshe Rabbeinu, about the Jews themselves, only about Balak's attempt and Bilam's attempt to curse the Jewish people. But very little is mentioned about the Jewish people themselves. And till the end of the Sedra. And then, so the question is, why is the Torah go into so much detail to tell us about Bilam's attempt to curse the Jewish people? Why does the Torah give such significance to Billam? It's true, Billam was a Navi, a prophet, but we refer to him as Bilam of Russia, Billam the wicked one. So why does the Torah go into so much detail? It's not just a one pasuk, a second pasuk, but it's the whole Sedra. As a matter of fact, the Chachamim were thinking of taking Parshas Balak and putting that in Kriya Shema, because there it discusses Yetzias Mitzrayim, it discusses the exodus from Egypt. And the reason they didn't do it is because of Tirchut Tzibura, because it's so long. So the Torah goes into every detail about Billam. And the question is, why is the Torah telling us so much about Billam? And there is a question that many ask. The Gemara in Bava Basra says that the Gemara in Bava Basra discusses the different books of Tanakh, who wrote the different books. So when it talks about Chamisha Chumshei Torah, it says, Moshe Kosav Sifro, Moshe wrote his book, and he also wrote the Chamisha Chumshei Torah, his book, which is the Chamisha Chumshei Torah, Who Parshas Billam, and also the Sedra of Parshas Balak, Parshas Billam. And the question is, Parshas Billam is part of the Torah. So why does it say Moshe Kosav Sifro u Parshas Billam? Just say Moshe wrote his book. Parshas Billam is part of the Torah. And then there's a medrash in the Yalkut Shimoni, the Zos HaBracha. Zos HaBracha says, Lo Kambi Yisrael to Moshe. They did not arise among the Jewish people like Moshe. And the Yalkut Shimoni says, Avobumos Olam come. But among the nations of the world, there did arise one like Moshe. And who is that Billam? Billam of Russia is being equated with Moshe Rabbeinu. How are we to understand that? So now we have to understand, what is the definition of Torah? Rashi, at the beginning of Parshas, I've mentioned it many times. Rashi, at the beginning of Parshas, says, Lo haya haTorah tzarech lahaspil ela mehachodesh hazel lechem rosh kadosh. The Torah should have began with the first mitzvah, shehi mitzvah rishona shenital Yisrael, which was the first mitzvah given to the Jewish people. And which is the first mitzvah? The mitzvah of the calendar, of proclaiming the new month, of proclaiming the new year. So that was the first mitzvah of the Torah. And everybody asked the question, there are all kinds of other mitzvahs that I mentioned earlier, period of Arivia, having children, Gid Hanoshe, Bris Milah. So there are other mitzvahs that I mentioned before HaKodesh Hazel Lechem Rosh Chodashim. But the answer I heard from my father, it's based on the Rambam Perish HaMishnah, is that the halacha is that what is the definition of Torah? The definition of Torah is that which was given by Moshe Rabbeinu. It's true that the mitzvah period of Arivia, the mitzvah of Gid Hanoshe, the mitzvah of Bris Milah was given beforehand. But we do not observe it today because of the mitzvah, because it was given beforehand. We observe the mitzvah because later that mitzvah was repeated to Moshe Rabbeinu. The definition of Torah is that which was given to Moshe Rabbeinu. And that is where that's one of the areas where Moshe Rabbeinu is not just greater than all the other prophets, but he stands in a category all for himself. And what Reb Chaim said was that, so Reb Chaim said that Billam, and this has to be understood, the Parshas of Billam, Matovu Alecha Yaakov, the prophecies that Billam gave, that God forced him to say, that was said through the mouth of Billam, those prophecies were also came Torah. They came Torah not only when Moshe Rabbeinu said it and wrote it down, but it became Torah when it left the mouth of Billam. So that's why we say Moshe Kosav Sifro Parshas Billam. Billam didn't write his nevuah, his prophecy, but it became Torah when it left his mouth. So so Moshe Rabbeinu wrote the Chamisha Chumshei Torah and Parshas Billam, which became Torah even beforehand. And that's also why the Elokambi Yisrael, but among the nations of the world, there did arise like Moshe, not Chas v'Shalom, that Billam could be equated with Moshe. But Billam, like Moshe, he gave certain parshas in the Torah the status of Torah. He gave it the status of Torah. So now the question is, why? Why should HaKadosh Baruch Hu use Billam Arasha to be the revealer of Parshios of the Torah? That it becomes Torah when those Parshios, those paragraphs of the prophecy that was uttered by Billam, it became Torah at that point, even before Moshe Rabbeinu repeated it and wrote it down. And our sages tell us, they asked the question, why was Billam appointed as a Navi? And so the Mefarshim say, the commentaries say, the reason Billam was appointed as a Navi was because God did not want the nations of the world, the ancient nations of the world, to have a claim. You showed favoritism to the Jewish people. You appointed Moshe Rabbeinu as their prophet. If you had given us a prophet who had the status of Moshe Rabbeinu, we would have accomplished and we would have been like the Jewish people. So to eliminate that, their ability to make that claim, so Billam was used by God as a prophet. But the question is, there were a lot of other people in the nations of the world. Initially, there was Yisro. We'll discuss that later. But Billam was Billam of Russia. Billam was the wicked one of the most wicked people throughout history. Why is it that God appointed Billam as the prophet for the nations of the world? And I think there are two answers. One answer, and this Rashi suggests, because the nations of the world at that time looked up to Billam. Billam became sort of like a religious figure to many of the religious groups at that time. And you see, Billam had special prominence. Billam was one of the advisors of Paro. Egypt was probably the center of civilization at that time. So he was a person who was respected and held in high regard. So to a certain degree, it wasn't God who appointed Billam. It was the nations of the world who appointed Billam as their spiritual leader. And God, in order that they shouldn't have a claim that their leader did not have the status of Moshe Rabbeinu, so because of that, God proclaimed Billam to be a prophet, and more than just a prophet, in order that he should have some status like Moshe Rabbeinu. Parts of the Torah became Torah, according to Reb Chaim, when those parshios, those paragraphs of the Torah, left Bilam's mouth. And it's true, it wasn't something Billam said voluntarily. It was things that God put in his mouth to say. But it became Torah at that point. Now, but I think there is another reason that we could explain why Billam was appointed as the leader, as the spiritual leader, as the prophet of the nations of the world. The Rambam's opinion is that prophecy is not supernatural, it's natural. When a person reaches a certain level, so automatically he becomes a prophet. And if a person, for some reason, who reaches that level doesn't become a prophet, that's a deviation from the natural manner. It has happened. The Gemara talks about Tanoim, Royu Shetishrael of Shechina, that they were deserving that the divine presence should be on them. El Shelo Zocha Hadolakach. The generation did not merit it. But the normal rule is that somebody who reaches a certain level, according to the Rambam, Mora Nevucha, of perfection, moral perfection, as well as intellectual perfection. So he naturally should become a prophet. And it's very interesting, it's very strange. The Rambam says, when he talks about intellectual perfection of prophecy, so he gives an example of someone who had such intellectual perfection, but of course he did not have any moral perfection, so he couldn't be a prophet. He says Aristotle had intellectual perfection, but he couldn't become a prophet. He did not have the moral perfection, the spiritual perfection. So, but when God was searching among the nations of the world for somebody who should be the prophet of the nations of the world, he couldn't find at that time anybody who had spiritual perfection, moral perfection. Because of that, the choosing of Billam was based on the fact that Billam was the intellectual, had intellectual perfection. Billam was the Einstein of his day, perhaps greater than Einstein. And that's probably why the nations of the world, even previous to his being appointed a prophet, looked up to him. So Billam is this spiritual, this intellectual, the intellectual giant of his time. But when we take a look at the whole episode of Bilam and Balak, Balak sends representatives to Bilam, and he says to Bilam, come curse the Jewish people. And Bilam says, I have to check with God. And God tells them that he can't do it. But ultimately he tries and tries again. And God tells him, you're not going to be able to curse them. If you want, go with them. And Bilam, hoping and hoping and hoping that God will change his mind, goes with them. He knew that it was impossible. But that's the idea. Kina, taiva, and kavod. Motzinas adam in olam, we say in Pirkei Avos. Jealousy, desire, kavod, looking for high regard, takes a person out of the world. What does it mean, takes a person out of the world? It means they lose contact with reality. Bilam, the giant, intellectual giant, where he was jealous, and he wanted regard, and he wanted money. He lost contact with reality. And it's very interesting that Bilam goes with his donkey, and the donkey sees a malach on the road. Bilam didn't see the donkey, the malach, did not see the angel. And because of that, the donkey realized that he couldn't pass by the angel. The angel was blocking the road. And Billam became very angry and started hitting his donkey. And then all of a sudden, his donkey opens its mouth and starts a conversation with Billam. Why is it that you hit me 3 times? And Billam engages his donkey in conversation. He doesn't for a minute think, hey, there's something strange going on here. Why? The intellectual giant Billam lost contact with reality. Even intellectual giants lose contact with reality when drives, all kinds of drives are involved. When they're jealous, when they have a drive for things that they enjoy, when they have a drive for high regard, they lose contact with reality. They could be Einstein, but they lose contact with reality. And we take a look, it's very interesting. The question is, why is it that the Malach, that the donkey saw the Malach, saw the angel, and Billam initially did not see the angel? Why is it that way? But there was a message there to Billam. Because Billam took great pride in the fact that he was selected by God to be the prophet. And he thought that that was indicative of the high level that he was on. That prophecy was something natural to him because of who he was and what he was. But then, God, by having the donkey seeing the angel and Billam not seeing the angel, it was a message to Billam. Billam, don't think it has to do with your level of perfection, moral perfection, of the high regard that we have of you in heaven. We do not have a high regard for you in heaven. It's just that the situation necessitated that you have prophecy. You see, even the donkey, who certainly wasn't on a high level, he could see the malach, he could see the angel where the situation demanded it, even where you couldn't see the angel. And Reb Chaim, Reb Chaim said that there was a difference. It's true. Billam was able to be the revealer of Torah Shabbat of the written tradition. Not that he wrote it, but the words of the Torah became Torah when it left Bilam's mouth. He said, but there is a difference between Billam and Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu, the way I heard it from my father, I saw it brought down another way in the name of Reb Chaim. But the way I heard it from my father, Billam was God's phonograph. I guess this was after Thomas Edison invented the phonograph. So Billam was God's phonograph. It didn't have to do with who he was. He was just selected to be the phonograph. He was an object. Whereas Moshe Rabbeinu, it's because of who he was. Others quote in the name of Reb Chaim, and it's very possible that Reb Chaim said both, that sometimes when you want a message delivered to somebody, you send a letter. Other times, the leader of a country, instead of sending a letter, will send an ambassador. There's a big difference between the postman and the ambassador. The postman, in a sense, does not add any importance to the message. But the ambassador does add importance to the message. Reb Chaim said that Billam, yes, he was a Navi. He was appointed a Navi, but not because of who he was. He was like a postman. But Moshe Rabbeinu was like God's ambassador. And so, in a certain sense, what the Torah is telling us here is, what the Torah is telling us here is that we all become very impressed with intellectual superiority. We're impressed with professors. We're impressed with scientists. But the truth of the matter is, what we have to be impressed with is the way they act. Because even the greatest professors, the greatest scientists, the greatest intellectuals, when kinna, taiva, and kavod is involved, they deviate in a maximum manner. My uncle mentioned that when he was a student at the University of Berlin before World War II, he said that his professors, he majored in philosophy, his professors, and he got his PhD in philosophy, his professors were the greatest philosophers in the study of ethics. And he says all of them, as soon as Hitler came in power, they all became the leading ideologues of the Nazi Party. In other words, all the intellectual achievement loses its meaning. And I think that is what the Torah tells us in Parshas Bo. Bo el Paro, come to Paro, ki ani hirbaditi es libo veslev avodav leman shisi osa sayela bekirbo. Go to Paro, because I hardened his heart, so I should perform the makos, the miracles, the plagues in his midst. And the question is that the reason to go? It should say, go to Paro in spite of the fact that I hardened his heart. But I once heard from one of my Rabbeim in high school, Shmuel David Herman. He was the grandson of the All for the Boss. I have a different shot, but he said over a shot, he said, you should know that everyone is capable of being like Paro. When we see how low Paro sank, that he was refusing to let the Jewish people leave Egypt, to the point where the whole Egyptian society was crumbling. We have to know that we could be the same way. We have to learn a lesson from people's failures, because the same could happen to us. And it's very interesting what he said. I'm not sure that he was aware, but really the Rambam, the Igros, says it. The Rambam says, Paro hu hayetzer hara. Paro is the Yetzer hara, the evil inclination. What does he mean by that? Don't think it's only something that could happen to Paro. We can all become like Paro. And in a sense, I think this is the reason why the Torah goes into so much detail about Billam. because Billam was the giant of his time, the intellectual giant of his time. And we all become very impressed when we see intellectual giants. But we have to know that intellect alone isn't what makes the person. Yes, it could be used, but the question is the person in control of himself? Or does he lose contact with reality? And he acts in a manner that ultimately will be his downfall. The Torah tells us about Paro, according to the Rambam, and the Torah tells us the Torah tells this to us also about Billam. Now, and there's another thing I think we could learn from here. One could question, I just answered, but I want to give another answer. It's not, doesn't try to take the first answer. What did Billam think? What did Billam think that he would get God to agree? God told him, no, you're not going to be able to curse them. No, you're not going to be able. First, he says, don't go. Then go, but make sure to say what I tell you. You're not going to be able to curse them. And nevertheless, he continues to do it. But he loses contact with reality. But there is a certain manner that he loses contact with reality. In other words, every time he came, Balak got people, the leaders of the country, the richest people of the country, to be there in the delegation welcoming him. There are some people that are stupid enough to believe, and this is even in our community, that people who have a big reputation, people who are rich, somehow being associated with them will have an impact on the way things will turn out. They're stupid enough to believe that God will become impressed. We have to know that God is not impressed. God has no need to be impressed. Al yishalel chacham b'chachmaso, al yishalel gibor b'gvuraso, al yishalel asher b'ashro. The only thing is knowledge of God. That is what impresses God. Dedication, devotion to Torah, helping people out who are needy. That is impressive. But just having money, just having power, and people sometimes when they don't have power, they feel like they're nothing. And because of that, they do all kinds of threats to make people believe, to try to talk themselves into think that they don't have power. It's not power that makes the person. And they begin to lose contact with reality. But what we have to know is Hashket V'Yodeosi. We have to know knowledge of God, doing chesed. Those are the things that really make the person. And I think that this is the lesson of Parshas Billam. Lesson of Parshas Billam is that we have to maintain contact with reality and not to think that just because someone is a great intellectual, that he's a special person. A special person is the person who acts in an ethical manner, not the person who has intellectual achievement. Intellectual achievement is very good, so long as it comes together with moral achievement. But if there is no moral achievement, if there's no religious achievement, then the intellectual achievement is not a positive thing, it's a negative thing. The Germans during World War II were very advanced, but look what they used their advancement for. And we have to know, we have to take a lesson from Billam, from Paro, and from all those that we encounter, that the main thing is the moral achievement that we have, the religious achievement we have, not the intellectual achievement. Okay. All right. I think, okay, I don't know if anybody's able to ask questions now. I guess maybe okay, I guess we'll all right, we'll leave it here, I guess. Okay.
We thank everyone for joining. Have a good week.